Thanks, Darren. Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here. Just a sort of quick caveat, I'm going to speak about the creative arts in general, but I'm a specialist in fine art. I'm an artist, and I'm also a writer and a cultural historian. So just to say, my perspective is specifically coming from that focus. But so I don't claim to speak for all the creative arts, but I will be speaking about creative arts generally, and hopefully making some generalizations about what the impacts of Gen AI are going to be on those. Before I sort of do so, I'm going to sort of hopefully I'll get through these 5 areas. I think importantly, we need to talk about intelligence and how intelligence is understood, specifically in terms of artificial intelligence. So I'll be speaking a little bit about that. I'll be speaking a bit about creativity, how that is understood generally, and the differences between the way creativity is understood in the tech world and the science world than the way it is in the art world. Then I'll look specifically at the creative arts, where I'll talk about which of the creative arts I believe are going to be most impacted, well, are already being most impacted by generative AI, and why that is. And I'm also going to make a case for those art forms which require full sensory experience, full embodied experience, both in their making and in their reception, are the arts which are going to be least affected. And those arts which are tied to commerce, business, and screen and audio are already being transformed and will be increasingly transformed by generative AI. There's going to be a slight digression then into sort of a critical, theoretical, and philosophical pair of ideas, transhumanism and accelerationism. And I'll do that to explain that these debates about the impacts of technology on society, and particularly on the arts, have been going on now in the world that I inhabit for 30 years. And I'll talk about where those ideas came from and how they are now kind of finding fruition in the current situation that we find in the United States and the accelerationist impulse behind what's going on there. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And finally, I want to say that from where I stand, I think the way that the arts are moving are away from technology and generative AI, generally, broadly speaking, and towards creative health. So the arts will be increasingly important for our health and well-being than they will be for commerce and business, where AI will be hugely important. So that's the basic things I'm going to be talking about today. First off, the use of generative AI tools in the creative arts. Again, there's basically 3 types of tools that are being used in different arts. Image tools like text-to-image, Midjourney, DALL-E, Desgo, and these are rapidly changing. Some of the ones that were free then become subscription-based, and new ones come on the market or onto the internet. So these are some of the most famous ones. Music generation, AI. I don't use those personally, but colleagues do. And text AI, which again, I guess most of us use. So those are the kind of tools that are being used. There's many of them, and they're being used by artists and creatives across the spectrum. There's very few artists and creatives today who aren't using these tools in one way or the other. Just some sort of, there's lots of examples, but in terms of creative writing, there's this text by Kay Lardo McDowell from 2020, I believe, maybe 2022, written in so-called collaboration with an early version of ChatGPT. And it's a kind of very sort of slightly psychedelic West Coast narrative about the future of humanity and what our relationship to technology will be in the future, written with ChatGPT 2, I think it was. In the middle is a painting by a colleague of mine called Theo Bagiotas, who's an artist who was already making work about the cult of technology, as many artists have, and is now using Midjourney to develop his own paintings. And finally, quite famous, people may or may not know this, there's lots of AI in popular music. There's the album called Oasis, which is the lost tapes of Oasis, which is a AI generated Oasis album, which apparently one of the Gallaghers has said is very good. And this kind of thing is everywhere now. So on the internet, you'll find these kinds of things everywhere. So lots of artists are using them in different ways in their practices. Now, I just want to say a little bit about intelligence first. Now, these definitions of intelligence come from Google Gemini, which I've just started using as a text AI tool. One of the nice things about Google Gemini is compared to ChatGPT or DeepSeek is that it actually gives you references, which the other text AIs didn't used to do. So it will give you links to the sources of the information. Just to say that's very useful. It's also useful for teaching, and it's a new development. But as everyone says in these sessions, the speed of this development is quite shocking. So, these things will change rapidly. But this is what I use straight from Google Gemini to get the definitions of these key terms. So the interesting thing here, starting with this very friendly tone, intelligence is a tricky thing to define, even for humans. There's no single universally agreed upon definition, but here are some key aspects that often come up. Now, the important point here is there isn't any single universally agreed upon definition. There's multiple understandings of intelligence. So we often talk about AI, artificial intelligence, as if it was one thing, a single thing. It certainly isn't. There's multiple modes of intelligence, multiple ways of thinking about intelligence. But the way that's come to dominate, in fact, in terms of artificial intelligence, is linked to technology, mathematics, and science. So problem solving, reasoning and logic, understanding and comprehension, and communication. These are the main ways in which intelligence is understood by Google Gemini. Now, I don't want to go too far into that. It's one way of understanding intelligence, but there are lots of other ways. The second definition of artificial intelligence is that artificial intelligence is a broad and rapidly evolving field, as we know. At its core, it's about creating machines that can perform tasks that typically require human intelligence. This includes things like, and it's the same list of 5 things, roughly, slightly different, but it's basically the same: reasoning, learning, problem solving, perception, which here goes across into understanding and interpreting sensory input, and language understanding, which was communication in the last definition. So again, these are very science-based understandings of intelligence, and we'll see the same happens when we get interpretations of creativity. One thing that we do, I'll talk more about in fine art and fine arts education, is a lot of contextual and critical studies where we look at the history of concepts, the history of ideas, the philosophy of art. And it's quite well known within those fields that artificial intelligence is really a development of IQ testing and IQ measurement. The history of intelligence as understood today goes back to Francis Galton and eugenics, and the notion of hereditary genius and how you measured genius. This then developed into child psychology and how you measured different stages of cognitive development amongst young children. This was people like Piaget, who were interested in assessing students for their levels of development. It was quite a positive thing in a way, because the idea was if you found students that weren't quite at the right level, then you should put your energy into bringing them up to the level they ought to be at cognitively, according to these theories of general intelligence. This then became IQ testing in the 50s and 60s, and since then it moved over into computing. But there's a quite clear trajectory from eugenics, hereditary genius, education, to AI as it's understood in the scientific community. So that's very important to remember where this notion of artificial intelligence came from. Creativity. Like, as I said, creativity is understood in the scientific and tech community quite differently than it is in the arts. And we can see here these terms I've highlighted. Creativity is the ability to generate new and valuable ideas. We need to really start thinking about what is valuable. We'll come back to that. But notions of value are hugely important. Within the arts, we don't just value the economic or the monetary or the quantitative. The values which we work with are much more nuanced than that and subtle. We don't only value solutions to problems, but we do value expressions, and there's a lot of personal expression, as you all know, in the arts. Pushing the boundaries of what is considered normal or possible, we do that in the arts. In the tech world, often novelty and innovation is understood as doing something unexpected, and often it's machines that do something unexpected that is seen to be novel and creative. And again, this definition distinguishes between art and music to science and technology. So it does see creativity working across these different fields. but its focus is on solving problems, innovation, and they say in this final term, enriching our lives. And as with values, how we consider richness and wealth is also something that we're very concerned with in the arts. It's not purely an economic idea of richness and wealth that we have. I spoke at a conference last year, then I just want to say a little bit about that on creativity and artificial intelligence in Athens. I want to just quickly go over the kind of panel and just to give you a quick idea who was there and what their perspectives were. So Professor Linian Mitru wasn't there, but a colleague from the European Union was, and they were speaking about legislation in Europe about mainly copyright and artificial intelligence is a big issue, the ethics of accidents with self-driving cars, and bias within AI. Those were the concerns that were expressed there. Dr. Yanis Asael was from Google DeepMind, and also Milady Strombu from Microsoft, just to say that clearly represented with the big tech companies who really are leading the narrative about AI at the moment, and obviously aim to be making the most money from it, as they already are with all the other tech products that they control. There's me. I was brought in, I was slightly the gloomy person about all this, which will become clear why. My colleague Theo, as I said, who is making paintings using generative AI tools. Dr. Manolis Kellis, really interestingly, he's what I would really call an AI evangelist. He's a molecular biologist at MIT, and he really believes that AIs are going to solve all the world's problems, from global poverty to disease to cancer, and even in the end, maybe death. So there's a very kind of massively what we call extropian. I'll explain that later. This idea that technology fusing with humans will lead to possibly the end of death, but certainly the curing of all ills for humans. And he was certainly very evangelical about that idea. Obviously, a brilliant person doing amazing work. Milady Stombo, I've said already, and Lilian Balatsu, again, an AI evangelist, very interested in bringing women into technology, which is an important thing I'll talk about perhaps in a moment. And Dr. Aspasia Destuni, who is, again, a geneticist, molecular biologist, very keen on what generative AI can do and AI generally can do for that field. So mainly these were tech people, representative of big tech companies, with two of us who spoke from the position of being artists and involved in arts education. So we were talking about the creative arts, and again, Google Gemini definition, broad group of disciplines that involve the production of works that are considered to be aesthetically pleasing. What we make are beautiful things, or things which make people happy or stimulate people's senses. They also are expressive of inner personal expression, personal thoughts, beliefs, values, etc. So it's much more human-centered and bodily centered. The creative arts are often contrasted with the useful arts, and this is one of the issues that the arts often have, is that they're not seen to be useful in this practical, technical, problem-solving sense, and they don't necessarily make a lot of money, which is why they're often seen as not valuable. But obviously the values of art are different from the values of technology or commerce, and we need to really make that clear. And part of those values are entertainment, also education and social commentary. We have a very important role to play in looking at the social transformation of the world from the outside and commenting on that. So yeah, this is a fundamental difference between the notion of creativity within technology and within the creative arts. That ours is more human-centric, emotional, expressive, linked to the body, and about values which can't necessarily be captured by monetary or economic or statistical values. So within the creative arts, and this was my thesis in Athens, was that the creative arts will be affected differently. This is a broad overview of the kind of arts that we do at Worcester, actually, mostly, not all of them. But this is the kind of arts, and obviously they're all different, and every one of these different creative arts will have a different perspective. And I'm speaking from fine art, but somebody speaking from game art, graphic design, illustration will have a slightly different take on this. So it's really important to recognize that it isn't a one-size-fits-all perspective. But my perspective is that, as I said, those art forms which involve the body, both in their production and in their reception, are going to be less transformed immediately than those art forms, those creative arts, which are already geared towards commerce, business, screen-based media, and audio. The more commercially driven fields. They're already being massively transformed. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. So my argument in Athens was that it's the embodied artistic practices which are going to be affected less. And I'll say a little bit about fine art and why that is. So fine art is a fundamentally studios-based practice. You have to make things in a studio, in a physical space. You don't work so much on screen. That's because the kind of objects we make in fine art are exhibited in physical spaces that you have to walk around them, see them with your eyes, touch them, hear them. You have a full embodied experience of fine art still, on the whole. I mean, we do make things digitally and on screens, etc., but the tradition is still physical objects made in studios to be exhibited and seen by living people walking around them. We have a collective mode of teaching where you learn together, often using workshops. So there's this kind of collaborative mode of teaching and learning, which also happens in the studios. And you have a very personal journey. No one tells our artists what they're going to make, how they should make. It's not dictated to them by the outside. It comes from them. So it's very personally driven. And we also have four modes of teaching, which are the seminar, the lecture seminar, the group crit, the one-to-one tutorial, and the workshop, which are also very interpersonal, collaborative modes of learning. And these lead to what are being called the studio habits of mind. So this combination of working in studios and working with these four teaching methods leads to these particular habits of mind. I won't go too far into the educational issues here, but there's a big issue that I will just touch upon, which has been to do with the massively damaging effects of arts and arts education, of the STEM agenda that's been in place in secondary schools for the last, well, since 2011. I was at a conference in Newcastle last weekend. I have some imagination about imagining the future of arts education, and there were young people from secondary schools speaking there, and the picture they painted was an absolutely dismal one of the devaluation of arts education in British schools, which is discouraging people from going on to do the arts. Interestingly, this study, Studio Thinking, which came out of American academics who were trying to find out whether or not studying art improved your grades in other subjects at secondary level. And what they found was they didn't, in fact, improve your grades. But what they did find was that students who'd been exposed to art at an early age were very good at art and also very good at geography and also very good at history. So what we're finding is we really need to be exposing young people to creativity and art at a very early age and encourage them to continue to do that instead of stopping them doing it when they go to their A levels or O levels because they're told there's no future or career in it. And this is what's been happening in the UK for the last 10 or so years. And it's why there is something of a crisis in UK arts education, but I think we can move away from that, which I'll try and explain. The skills that we develop through studio practice actually align very clearly with the 10 top skills identified by the World Economic Forum as what will be needed in the future. I just paralleled those there. This slide is for anybody who wants to take it away and look at it. So strangely, what's odd is this, despite the kind of the broad culture of critical criticism about arts and arts education and its impoverishment in the last 10 years, what we know is that the habits of mind that it brings are actually really valuable for the future employment market. So we need to realign the habits of mind of studio arts education with the future workplace, which is something we're talking about with colleagues around the country. One other side of the arts education is this social commentary, thinking about art in the wider context, thinking how arts operate in the wider society. On our fine art degree at Worcester, we have two strands, research and sight, which look at art history, the way artists have worked in the wider society, how they continue to do that. Artists have long spoken about and thought about and expressed concern about technology, economics, social injustice. This is widely known, and we do this all the time in arts education. One of my colleagues, Dean Kenning, is particularly strong on this, and he came and gave a workshop using generative AI text-to-image tools, but also with this amazing diagram that he uses, poster. If anybody wants to scan that QR code in the corner, there's a whole list of workshops and assignments that you can do linked to this illustration of how deep learning operates in generative AI. And we do this kind of teaching all the time, and it's part of an expanded arts practice where what we do as educators is linked to our practice as artists. now I want to talk about these two more things. I've got a few more minutes, hopefully, maybe 10 minutes. Is that good? Okay, so you may not have heard these terms, but you may have. They've been around in, saying the discourse around arts and technology for 20, 30 years. Transhumanism, a philosophical and intellectual movement that advocates for the use of technology to enhance human capabilities and improve the human condition. Transhumanists believe that humans can and should use technology to transcend their current limitations, such as aging, disease, even death. The colleagues I mentioned in Athens, the biologist from MIT, is very much in this transhumanist mode. An accelerationist, controversial. Acceleration is a complex and controversial ideology that has gained traction in recent years. At its core is the idea that we should accelerate the process of social change, particularly the development of capitalism and technology, in order to hasten the arrival of radical social transformation. And as you're probably all well aware, that the Elon Musk, Donald Trump axis of technocratic power is really pushing this. JD Vance spoke at the European Conference in Artificial Intelligence just this week. I think this is very much the perspective, and I'll explain where this perspective has come from, that seems to now be adopted by the American government. So it came from science fiction. And it came from the science fiction of writers like Philip K. Dick, William Burroughs, J.G. Ballard, and William Gibson, who, for a long time, already in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, were thinking about the impact of the relationship between humans and technology. Just to say, these were rather pessimistic dystopian visions. It wasn't a good scenario that they imagined when humans started to fuse with machines. So just to bear that in mind. I won't say too much about this, but William Gibson's hugely important for what was called cyberculture in the 1990s. This is just a quote from Philip K. Dick, written towards the end of his life around 1981, talking about this integration of humans and machines. The biochip is the greatest breakthrough of information storage. The biochip is alive when it's implanted in the brain. It will grow into the nervous system of the brain. It will grow into the neural tissue. And the lovely thing is, when the host dies, you'll pull out the biochip out, and now it's got the host memories, which you could then insert into another host. These are the kind of visions that sci-fi was predicting from. This was written in the night. These visions were there in the 1960s and 70s. But that, what became called cyberculture, influenced a lot of thinkers in the 1990s. And this conference was a groundbreaking conference at Warwick that I attended. And this is where these debates really started being talked about. Manuel de Landa, who spoke, he's one of the first person to write about war in the age of intelligent machines. Pat Gadigan is a cyberpunk novelist. But the two kind of most important people here are Sadie Plant and Nick Land. Sadie Plant was what was called a cyber feminist, talking about women and technology. She was also a situationist. She wrote a book called The Most Radical Gesture. Very, very important figure in connecting women with technology and the writing out of women in technology and bringing people back into that history to show that women had an important role to play, not only in the history of computing, but also in its future, where it went in the future. And Nick Land, the most controversial figure, who is the person I'll talk about most. Nick Land is just Jay's a colleague, I would say a friend. I've known him since 1992, but he's a very, very controversial figure, and I'll explain a little bit why that is. But the first thing to say about this is that at this time, these kind of theories were like hacker culture. It was very radical left wing. It was feminist, and it was really against capitalism, patriarchy, the dominant order of social control. So this was very radical left-wing stuff. But what has happened is since that time, Nick Land, it's a long story, has become increasingly right-wing, and he developed something called neo-reaction in the 2010s, started talking about accelerationism. He was talking about acceleration before then. And his thinking has led to, people believe, the situation partly that we have right now in America. If you want to find out more about that, this article that's just come out, you can really see it. So just to say, this is what I've been engaged with for the last 30 years, the kind of thinking. So for me, a lot of debates about the impacts of AI are kind of, well, we've been talking about this a long time. They're not new in the field of arts and culture and philosophy and theory. So anyway, you can just go and see that yourself. So just to say a little bit about Nick's philosophy and how he ended up where he did with this neo-reactionary alt-right belief that countries should be run like corporations, which is what Elon Musk seems to have taken on. These various cycles. And I'm running out of time, but I'll just get this done. The first is the Kondratev cycles. Nikolai Kondratev, Soviet economist, very similar to Joseph Schumpeter, the belief that there are business cycles that have roughly over 50 years, peaks and slumps. And every time there's a slump in the business cycle, a new technology is invented to make capital rise again into the hands of those who own it. This pattern was well accepted. It's very close to, say, to Schumpeter's creative destruction cycles. But what Nick Land was doing was connecting it with something called time wave zero, which is a much longer timeline developed by countercultural psychedelic figure called Terence McKenna, who was taking a lot of mushrooms in the Amazon jungle, mixing it with the I Ching, and develops this theory of novelty, that we'd reached a kind of intensified novelty. We were coming, and he was the person who said that the world was going to end in 2012, if you ever wondered where that idea came from. Nick really believed that. And he combined it with Ray Kurzweil's notion of the coming singularity. So the belief was that around 2012, the singularity would happen. It would be the end of the human race and machines would take over. It didn't happen like that. But the thinking behind it was already built into these kind of models, which was what these thinkers were thinking through and still are. And that's informed Mustafa Suleyman's the coming wave idea. Mustafa Suleyman worked for DeepMind. Was it DeepMind, the AI that did develop the Go? Anyway, so knows what he's talking about. But these were the thinking behind it. One thing I should just say too, really important about Nick Land's philosophy: Nick is and was an anti-humanist, deeply apocalyptic. He wants the end of the human race. He wants machines to take over because he thinks machines are more intelligent and better than humans, and that's a very nihilistic, negative picture. But it's been taken up by people who seem to think it's a very positive picture if humans fuse with machines and machines are allowed to control as much of the economy as possible. I use this in teaching, something similar to this in my teaching. So in my teaching, we talk about the way technology affects people over different generations. This is called the intergenerational matrix. It shows that however old you are, you share a world with people of different ages who've had different experiences. And it also enables us to see where the current mode of artificial intelligence is coming from. And the really crucial thing here is that it didn't really happen until we got Web 2.0, social media and smartphones, because it was only then that you could do the kind of deep learning that was necessary. So it wasn't until they started gathering all the data that we were using on phones that generative AI could be developed. Before that, it was a different model of AI, symbolic logic model. And that's the big shift. So the big shift has happened because we're all using mobile phones, because they're gathering our data. The more we use our mobile phones and computers, the more generative AI will learn from us. So that's what's happening. What's also happening, and this is from Jonathan Haidt's The Anxious Generation, is that there's a massive increase in anxiety and common mental health problems, particularly amongst the young, and an increasing examples of loneliness happening. And Jonathan Haidt, you probably know this, he identifies it specifically with the smartphone as where this is coming from. And we're seeing this with students too. It's where the university has statistics on this, the increased common mental health issues and anxiety. Okay, I don't want to say if it's entirely down to smartphones, and the important here is that you have phones that can access the internet directly, and that's the main big difference. Before that, you couldn't. But anyway, this is important for where I'm going next. So sorry, give me 5 more minutes. Creative health. So for those of you who aren't familiar with creative health is a field that recognizes the powerful impact of arts, culture, and creativity on our overall well-being. It encompasses a wide range of activities from visual and performing arts to crafts, film, literature, cooking, and creative activities in nature. These activities can play a significant role in preventing illness, promoting health, aiding recovery, and enhancing quality of life. And these, what I talked about as the 8 studio habits of mind, and certainly the way we're working in fine art, is that the studio habits of mind align also very closely with what are seen to be the 5 ways to well-being that have been identified by the New Economics Foundation and are now accepted by the NHS, which is to connect, be active, take notice, keep learning, and give. These are all things we do within studio-based arts practices and within fine arts all the time. So we're already well positioned to move towards creative health. And this is from the National Centre for Creative Health. If people aren't familiar with creative health, it's now it's a national movement. There are creative health systems now set up in West Yorkshire. It's pretty big in Gloucestershire, and it's linked to social prescribing. I won't go too far into this, but it's definitely about using the arts to increase people's well-being and quality of life, and for them to contribute to the world with a sense of meaning and purpose. So that's where we're going with at least within the fine art course and fine art with psychology at Worcester. That's the direction of travel. So here are my 5 closing sort of takeaways from this presentation. 1, generative AI is already used in the day-to-day practice of many creative arts, a trend which will continue. 2, it will democratize access to knowledge and creative tools, lowering the cost of entry to professions and reducing production costs. This will amplify the trend towards de-skilling in the creative and educational sectors and lowering of wages, which is well recognized. Generative AI will impact those arts most closely tied to commerce and business. These tend to be screen and audio-based arts made for distribution on digital platforms, rather than those which create unique physical artifacts and events based on the embodied lived experience of humans that need to be experienced in real space and time. Those creative arts grounded in the lived and personal experience of its creators that use slow, material-based and more fully embodied production processes and that encourage collaboration and participation will become closely aligned to the health and well-being in the coming decades. And that's the end of my presentation. So I'll stop sharing.